This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
And good afternoon. Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Members of the public might like to follow us on Twitter at the London Assembly, so that's at London Assembly, or use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch phones to silent and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of the microphones. However, please feel free to eat your lunch and get comfortable. Today we are holding an investigation on the Greater London Authority consultation drafts of its new London Plan guidance on affordable housing and development viability. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I ask, and for those of us joining to observe, my name's Sakina Sheikh, I'm the chair. We've got Sean Berry, who's a Green Assembly member, Ellie Baker from the Labour group, who'll be joining in a moment, Emma Best and Andrew Boff from the Conservative group. Before we begin, can we have a few items of business to attend to? Can I ask our committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Assemblymember Fortune, for whom Assemblymember Boff is substituting.
And a sad outgoing goodbye to our former Deputy Chairman, Emma, who's now being replaced by Peter, so hopefully he'll be joining us for the next committee. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Can we note the membership and the chairing arrangements as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual general meeting on the 4th of May 2023? Can we note the committee's terms of reference as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 4th of May 2023? Can we please also note the standing delegations of authority to me as chair of the committee as set out in the agenda and as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 4th of May 2023? Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 22nd of March 2023? And can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meetings? Can we note the action taken by me, the chair of the committee, under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to agree, firstly, the letter to the Mayor of London with recommendations to improve the London Plan? And then secondly, the committee's recommendations considered by the London Assembly at its plenary meeting on the 18th of May 2023 on the London Legacy Development Corporation boundary area reduction consultation. Thank you again to members of this committee to help secure a cross-party response that we can present to the Assembly to adopt. Now, we move on to our main item of business, a discussion on London Plan guidance on affordable housing and development viability. My, this is an incredibly complicated subject that I have spent quite a lot of time trying to make my brain get familiar with. But luckily, we have an excellent panel who can do that for the committee. So I'm really grateful for everyone's time this afternoon, and we want to do a warm welcome to our first panel of guests. We're joined by Jules Pipe, CB, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, John Wacher, Strategic Planning Manager in the Viability Team at the GLA, Michaela Smith, Team Leader in the London Plan, GLA, and Jane Seymour, Viability Expert in the Viability Team at the GLA. Thank you very much for your time. As mentioned, this is a two-part panel investigation meeting, so we'll be starting with yourselves, and then I don't know how to, I'm not sure how you plan to organise yourselves, but I think it'd be really fantastic if there was some way of ensuring that you capture the feedback from the second panel, because we'll have obviously the industry here, and I think it'd be really great to make sure that their feedback's incorporated. But I'm sure it's already obvious as the way it's set out, but the aspiration from the committee is to be able to respond to the draft consultations. So we're really keen to hear from you today about particularly how it's developed since 2017, and also from industry to understand how it's being implemented on the ground and how we can ensure that we are delivering the best for London. So I will crack on with the first question, and I'll leave it to yourselves to decide who's best placed to start off with. Can you provide a brief overview on the proposals set out in the draft London Plan guidance documents and how they fit in with wider plans to increase the delivery of affordable housing in London?
Thank you, Chair. Well, obviously, the Mayor seeks to use all his planning and housing powers to increase the delivery of affordable homes in London, and these two documents seek to further that aim. As part of the Mayor's planning function, the LPGs provide further guidance on implementing London Plan policies designed to maximise the delivery of affordable housing. And this includes those relating to the threshold approach, the required tenure split, and they're all playing an important role in reversing the low levels of affordable housing delivery that we've seen prior to 2017, and ensuring that affordable housing is genuinely affordable. The policies have helped to embed affordable housing requirements in land values, which is a incredibly important aspect of these policies. It also sped up the planning system in countless instances in streamlining the approach that developers have to take in providing sufficient affordable housing to gain permission. And it's provided clarity for local planning authorities and certainty, and also in particular it's provided certainty for the development industry, which when they have to satisfy their lenders about the certainty of a project, if planning can give greater certainty, then they can give greater certainty to their lenders, and it's more likely that developments will proceed. We've seen how damaging uncertainty is with the recent issuing of consultation on second staircases and the lack of guidance that's forthcoming on that, and that we won't see any guidance probably until October at the earliest, probably much later, and we're seeing development grinding to a halt as a consequence. So certainty is absolutely a crucial thing for the sector, and we think that this approach that we've adopted to viability in particular has and affordable housing, through the threshold approach delivers that certainty. Obviously, the Mayor's also using his powers to fund housing associations and local authorities to deliver affordable homes through the AHP, and the affordable housing guidance sets out guidance on the approach to affordable housing funding for all applications. It includes the requirements for applicants, the requirement for applicants to explore the availability of grant and to use this to maximise affordable housing delivery wherever it's available. The guidance also sets out how it works alongside the threshold approach as well, including criteria about following how you can follow the fast track route, and also again ensuring additionality where grants available. Given the acute for new low-cost rent homes and the availability of grant through the second programme, the 21-26 AHP, and its inclusion for funding for social housing, the guidance also sets out that the Mayor's preference is clearly for the delivery of social rent homes. So that's probably an overview of where they are and what contribution that they do make to the delivery of affordable housing.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. I don't know if any of the other guests wanted to add at this point.
Thank you. I think you also just asked for a quick summary of some of the key changes within this guidance, and I'll kick off.
Yeah,
and
it's
then
actually my next question, so that's perfect. I just wanted to, some significant changes from the 2017 supplementary guidance, if you wanted to highlight those.
Do you want to go for it?
Yeah. Thanks, John. So I think a very basic change is just a splitting of what was previous a one document into two. So we now have the affordable housing guidance and the development viability guidance, although both are closely tied together. And these have been kind of streamlined from the previous 2017 version, because now quite a lot of the content is in London Plan policy, as we've had that examination and the publication. So that's just an overarching point. The key updates from our point of view is the increased emphasis on the delivery and the need for the delivery of social rent housing. This is the Mayor's preferred product, and the Mayor's preferred product for the required low-cost rent element of the affordable provision that developers are supposed to be bringing forward. The document sets out that social rent is the strong preference, and this is then supported by the Mayor's Affordable Homes programme, which of course now has funding, or skewed toward funding for social rent homes. We've also made clear that applicants, in order to follow the fast track route, will also have to meet local plan tenure splits, as well as what is set out in the London Plan. So the London Plan is the 30% intermediate, 30% low cost rent, and 40% of the borough's choice. But in order to fast track, which is to get to the 35%, you would need to also follow those local plan tenure splits, which are heavily skewed towards low-cost rent. So in the round, most of those are either 70 or 60% low-cost to intermediate. So that in itself should help us kind of deliver more of the social rent homes that we need. In addition to that, we're placing a greater focus on the provision of intermediate homes for key workers, so encouraging councils to adopt eligibility criteria that prioritises key workers for new intermediate homes, and that would allow for a 3-month marketing period whereby these would first be prioritised for key workers, and that could cascade down to other local eligibility criteria from that point if they weren't taken up. This, in addition to raising this prioritisation, it also makes reference to the Mayor's Housing Policy Practice Note, which was called Allocating Intermediate Homes to Key Workers, which was produced, I believe, in 2021 by Housing and Land colleagues. And that note defines what is a key worker and gives a bit more information on how to allocate those homes, and that advice is for councils and providers. It's not within the document at the moment, but we are consulting on a potential increase to the to the household income cap for intermediate rental products. So the question posed in the consultation is, should we raise this from the current capped amount, which is 60,000 per year for household income, to 67,000? That 60,000 has been in play since 2017. And we are asking this question to determine if a rise is appropriate, acknowledging that there has been a rise in median household incomes since 2017, and also partially to increase the number of middle income households, because of course that's what intermediate rental products are designed for, that are in need of intermediate rents to actually be eligible to access it. So that would include key workers, because it's possible right now for 2 key workers living together to exceed the 60,000 cap, and therefore they still can't afford market properties and they can't access intermediate rent where they should be. And it's also to acknowledge that there has been some reports from providers that finding households below this cap is becoming more difficult. So there's a potential question posed there over whether or not we should do that. We have also introduced new guidance on service charges. We've actually increased our section on that from the previous 2017 guidance, and speaking to the Mayor's service charge charter that funding partners are expected to sign up to. We set out requirements to help service charges be affordable to affordable housing residents. And state that tenants should be given the same right of access to facilities and services regardless of tenure, and that there should be no additional charge other than the service charge that's presented. There is also an extra section in there that talks about if the LPA considers to be a service charge, the local authority considers there to be a service charge that is unaffordable or would be unaffordable to our affordable residents, it should be excluded from the standard charge with the option of rights of access for a fair and reasonable charge provided to other tenants. We also have a new section which the Deputy Mayor touched on around grant and making it clear, that there is the separate affordable homes programme, but how that interacts with the threshold approach to planning applications in order to access grant. And I think from my point of view, that is the key things. Is there anything else to add from anyone else?
Would you like us to deal with the viability guidance now or later?
Yeah, no, what we'll do is, let me just come back on viability guidance. Thank you, John. Michaela, that was really informative. Thank you. And I just pick up on 2 things that actually came off the back of our conversation yesterday in Housing Committee as well. So I found the areas that you've elaborated on, in particular around service charge, really reassuring. And actually one thing that we flagged to the Deputy Mayor for Housing, Tom Copley, yesterday, which is the service charge charter that the GLA has, just ensuring that all our partners know, well, obviously they know we have an expectation for them to have signed up to it, but just to go back and check that that is the case, and for those who haven't signed up to it, for us to offer them a reminder of our expectation. But I found the details that you've elaborated on really reassuring. And I think the issue as well that we'll probably come to a little bit later as well on the potential raising of the cap to 67, again, something we discussed yesterday is whether there'd be consideration for that to go even further, given the kind of context, I think the economic context that we're in, but, you know, just to reflect, like you said, the instance where you might have 2 key workers in the same household. So I just wonder whether there'd be any flexibility for that. But I don't know if you want to come back on that last point before we bring John in.
Yeah, thank you. I think on that point there's a balance to be struck, because what we're trying to do is enable a greater number of households to access intermediate rent housing, particularly 2-earner households, with the greater focus on key workers as well. However, it could also have the effect of increasing slightly housing costs at the upper limit. And so what we've done is looked at how incomes on average have changed over the last 5 years. It's broadly around 10%, which has led us to the 67,000 figure. What that also does is it enables delivery to be improved and viability, because we have a situation where if costs are increasing but rents don't increase at the upper limit, then the value of the properties to providers decreases over time. It's a depreciating asset. So that has a material impact on viability, which affects the proportion of affordable housing that can be delivered, and also the type of affordable housing when we do look at viability. So it might have a knock-on impact on the amount of social or low-cost rent that can be provided. So there is a balance to be struck. We think that 67 is the right ballpark at the moment. Pushing it higher would increase housing costs, albeit there is a requirement to provide incomes and housing costs at a range of levels below the upper limit. But yes, so, you know, broadly speaking, that's the evidence base points to a 67,000 figure at this stage.
That's really helpful clarity, John. Thank you. And did you want to continue to walk us through the viability LPG?
Yes. If I could just actually start by just saying a bit about the threshold approach in the SPG, and then we'll move on to viability. So the 2017 SPG was introduced largely to try and reverse the downward trend in affordable housing delivery that we'd seen in the previous years. And there a couple of issues had been at play. I think we'd seen a reduction in affordable housing grant, but also an approach to viability, which we'll come on to in a moment, which had led to market value or land transactions being used as a fixed cost within viability assessments, and that had the impact of reducing affordable housing in terms of the output of that valuation process. So first of all, just on the threshold approach, the intention was to, by setting a 35% threshold, enable applicants to be incentivised to provide more affordable housing than they were at the time. And I remember dealing with schemes before I came to the GLA, very large developments in London proposing 20%, 24%. There were a number of very highly controversial cases at the time. So increase the level of affordable housing to 35%, 50% on public land and industrial land where the industrial floor space is not being re-provided, and also to provide more certainty to the market so that they were actually factoring in these costs into land values, as the Deputy Mayor mentioned, but also to speed up the process as well. So we've now been applying that for around about 5 years, and we monitored this through the referable applications that come to the Mayor, and we've seen a marked increase in the proportion of affordable housing over that time period. So we look at this in a number of different ways. First of all, the proportion of affordable homes secured in strategic schemes approved by the Mayor last year has increased to 38%, and that compares with 25% in 2016. That's the highest level since the data was first recorded in 2011. When we look at it in terms of the average per scheme, it increased to 41% by unit and 45% by habitable room, and that's also the highest figure that we've seen over that time period since 2011. We also have the highest level of schemes now following the fast-track route, with 2/3 or 66% of eligible schemes following the fast-track route. And also we've seen a higher proportion of low-cost rent and social rent last year as well. So overall, reflecting on that, we feel that the market has responded well to the policy, that the affordable housing levels have increased significantly, and there have been a number of other benefits there as well. So just turning to viability, the point that I mentioned around land values being inflated was known as the circularity issue, and this committee actually looked into the issue in 2015. I gave evidence to that committee in my previous role, and then the committee reported to the previous mayor, setting out a range of different recommendations. One of those recommendations was to take a different approach to benchmark land values, and that was to use an approach known as existing use value plus, rather than a market value approach which had been introduced through the 2012 National Planning Policy Guidance and then national guidance in 2014 and professional guidance by the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors in 2012. So for a number of years we had a situation where land transactions, either for the specific site or other sites, were being used to inflate land values, and that was a fixed cost within viability assessments that was driving down affordable housing. There was a case in the London Borough of Islington that went to public inquiry in 2015. Initially, the inspector supported the role of market transactions and the conclusion that this previous site, which was public land, it was a territorial army centre, could only provide 14% affordable housing. That permission was actually refused by the inspector, but on separate grounds, and it went back to another inquiry in 2017 after the committee had released their report, and various other reports had been published at the time by select committees in the Commons and the London Housing Commission. At that particular time, there was more awareness around the circularity issue, and the inspector found in favour of the council and refused planning consent. And that case ended up in the High Court, following a legal challenge by the developer. And the judge in that case found in favour with the council and recommended that the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors would update their guidance. And that's a process that subsequently took place over the last couple of years, and Jane sat on the committee that worked on that revised guidance. So the Mayor's guidance in 2017 adopted that existing use value approach, and that has been crucial for viability tested schemes to ensure that we are securing the maximum viable level of affordable housing. So where developments can't provide the 35% or 50%, they are still able to come forward, but we are ensuring that the most affordable housing that can be delivered is provided. And then we also have a system of review mechanisms as well. I'll just pass over to Jane, if I may, who'll just speak to a bit more of the detail in the viability guidance.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. So just to follow up on what John was saying about the approach to land values. The idea is for policy requirements to become embedded in land values, and that's the overall approach, and that is followed through into the latest guidance. So there's some more details about the approach to benchmark land value. Just maybe start with looking at what the two key objectives are of the new viability guidance. It's firstly to explain the principles and processes of viability assessment clearly, so that they're more accessible to all stakeholders, accepting that it is quite technical, but we've clearly set out the process and the principles behind viability assessments. Secondly, it's to provide clarity on the approach to viability assessments to ensure they are robust and maximise the provision of affordable housing when schemes go down the viability tested route. By setting clear standards for viability assessments, we think this will streamline the process and make the review of viability assessments quicker and more effective. As John also mentioned, it mirrors the standards in professional guidance now, and that's quite important. There's a requirement that assessors should follow professional guidance and act, even if they're not chartered surveyors, and act in the public interest in preparing viability assessments. So that's a new element of the guidance. But I think it's fair to say that most viability assessments and the assessors preparing those documents already do follow the standards and the requirements that we set out in the new guidance. So we are really just making sure that that becomes more universal, that the standard is pulled up on all viability assessments, which we think will improve the speed of viability through the planning process. I'd just like to give a few examples of where the guidance has changed, and it is quite technical, but the new guidance includes a requirement that the outcome of viability assessments are sense-checked using evidence from other schemes and transactions. Sense checking involves checking the residual land value outcome of an appraisal against the price paid for similar sites, taking into account the amount of affordable housing and other planning obligations being delivered on that site. It's intended to ensure that the assumptions used in the viability assessment process are similar to those used by developers when acquiring sites. And an example of this, where this is not currently being followed, is an assessment that we've seen recently on a scheme in South London, where we know that the developer paid £7 million for the site, yet they've come in with a viability assessment that says with no affordable housing, the site is worth 1.8 million. Whereas if the new guidance and requirement of sense check would mean that the assessor would have had to go away and look at those assumptions more carefully, potentially look at different assumptions on profit and values. So the idea is to pull the commercial assumptions and planning assumptions more closely together. And that goes back round in terms of what I said initially, that this is to ensure that policy requirements become more embedded in land values. Another point is the guidance includes more of an emphasis on sensitivity testing. In other words, showing the outcome in different scenarios, if values were higher, values were lower, costs higher, lower, different assumptions in terms of profit. It's important to remember that it's up to the decision maker to decide the weight given to a viability assessment. And if they are able to see the outcome in a range of different scenarios, it's easier for them to do this. In terms of benchmark land value, which we talked about earlier, the guidance requires more evidence to support existing use valuations, especially where buildings are vacant or in poor condition. And it also sets out a more detailed approach to ensure that any premium above existing use value is justified in line with professional guidance, which involves providing a policy-compliant residual land value. So it's possible. So the idea is you continue enabling the decision maker to weigh up this decision between policy compliance and ensuring that land comes forward for development. The final point I'd like to make was in respect of the additional guidance on mid-term reviews, mid-term viability reviews. These are in addition to the early stage and late stage reviews. There's more guidance in terms of when they would be appropriate, and the idea of mid-term reviews is that they ensure that where schemes follow the viability tested route, and it's agreed that they can provide a lower initial level of affordable housing than policy level, then the reviews will capture any improvement in viability to provide more on-site affordable housing as the scheme is built out.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everyone. That was incredibly substantial, and my mind is just about managing to keep up, I think. So I'm keen to pass on to the other committee members, but there are still a few aspects of the questions I had down that haven't yet been addressed, and I think we've sort of covered the challenges that emerged for the 2017 SPG that the LPG is trying to address, so I probably won't ask that question. And I think you've also provided the evidence base that informed the decision to set out proposals to change the intermediate rent maximum income for the London Living Rent to 67,000. I think just the small follow-up on that one is, do you have an estimation on the number of key workers that's likely to impact the change?
I don't have an estimation on the number that it will impact. We do know that around 30% of London comes under the key worker definition in the previous note that I mentioned that was produced by Housing and Land in 2021. So I can't tell you from that number how many of those key workers would need low-cost rent versus the intermediate figure at the moment. It may be that we can have a look into that and come back to you, but we know that there is a huge proportion of London that are key workers and therefore could benefit.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And final question, do you have any plans to raise the 90,000 cap for shared ownership homes?
That's also me. We don't think that there is evidence to suggest that this would be a reasonable approach at the moment. Whilst there's been a kind of modest rise in household incomes, which we've talked about in relation to the intermediate rent, there is not a rise of average household incomes that would suggest it's coming anywhere near to the 90,000. And so at this time, we don't think that it would warrant a change, that cap. So that's at the moment proposed to stay at 90.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass over to Assemblymember Berry now for your set of questions.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm going to focus on a couple of parts of the affordable housing SPG, but just to say your goals towards clarity seem really quite good. I don't have that many questions. It's quite clear what you're doing, and it would be good to get more data from you. I think, John, you read out some numbers that are not currently in the monitoring reports that we get. We don't generally get the overall percentage. We get the reported numbers that make the threshold, if that makes sense. But to know the impact on the overall increase in the percentage of affordable housing in developments would be really useful. And so I want to ask, first of all, are you also tracking that for homes that are not referable? Because you would expect there to be a wider impact on other developments as well. I tried to do this using the old planning database, and I'm going to try and do it again using the new planning data hub once it has more data in it. And I sort of was seeing an increase in a similar way, and that was across all applications, not just, or all applications above 10 that would need to provide affordable housing. But yeah, are you able to give us anything you've got from the wider wider market, but also the full numbers of what you were reading out earlier on?
Yeah, thank you. So we've published a report recently, and very happy to provide that in terms of referable applications, and I'll come on to the bigger picture.
I think we've got that, but I don't think it has just the raw percentages, if that makes sense.
The report I'm thinking of has percentages and numbers.
Okay.
So both have gone up. So we've in 2022 the raw figure, the number of affordable homes is the highest over the entire period, and the percentage is the highest as well. But very happy to provide that if that's something you haven't seen already.
Yeah, would be good to have that. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. But yeah, and then the wider market, are you also tracking non-referable impacts of the policy, even though the policy doesn't directly apply?
Yes. So the London Plan is part of the statutory development plan for all schemes, so it is applicable, albeit, of course, we don't see those applications, and so we don't have as much control in terms of the outcome. And viability tested schemes, the non-referable, don't come to our team, so we don't have a role in checking the figures. There are some points around the data. Because the referable applications come to us, we have very up-to-date data and can look at it essentially in terms of the previous year. For non-referable schemes, we're more reliant on councils providing that data. It comes through the London Data Hub, and there tends to be a time lag of about a year. So it provides a less useful, less up-to-date basis to work out the impact of the policy.
That timescale will drop, you see. So yeah,
over time we're getting more of a sense, and I think the direction of travel is upwards, and we can have a look at that. I'll just search my notes and see if there are any figures I can give. But if not, we can provide some figures on that and give an indication as to how that's changed over the last couple of years. Right. I mean, the other just couple of caveats is that small sites, less than 10 units, aren't required to provide any on-site affordable housing under national policy, so that has an impact in terms of the overall figures. The figures also include schemes permitted under permitted development rights, which also aren't required to provide overall affordable housing. So
they'll have pulled it down a bit, I guess.
It does, yes. Yeah. But overall, the trend is upwards. I think perhaps if we could just return to that, and I'll check if I can give you any particular figures. If not, we can provide those afterwards.
Great. Okay. And then I want to ask about the threshold approach. A couple of questions on that. So one of the changes you've made is to remove the phrase "without public subsidy" from the guidance on whether or not you can use the fast track route if you reach 35%. Can you run through the rationale for that? Whoever's the right person to answer that question.
This is the 40% issue, isn't it? So I'm going to leave it to you, John.
Okay. Okay. Well, the requirement, the without grant requirement, is still there, and it's set out in the policy. So what we have sought to do is clarify the relationship between the new affordable homes programme and the threshold approach. Now, the two systems are slightly different because one falls under the Mayor's housing powers and the other under the planning powers. But there is a requirement within the London Plan to seek grant and to use it where available to maximise affordable housing delivery. So that hasn't changed. So under the guidance, the requirement is still to provide 35% to follow the fast track route on private land, so non-public and non-industrial. But there's a requirement both to access grant and to follow the fast track route to provide 40% with grant, so that there is always an element of additionality which is over and above the 35%.
Can you refer me to where that says that in the guidance, please?
Yes. Just bear with me one moment. And that is similar to the previous affordable housing programme under the developer-led route, where the 40% requirement was in place as well. So let me just get that.
4.2.
Thank you.
And there's a couple of paragraphs. 4.2, and then a couple of paragraphs throughout 4.2 that explain it in the round. And then the specific part you were looking for.
4.2.2.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chair, I'm just going to read that paragraph. That's all right. Got it. Okay, that's excellent. That's really useful. So are there any, because I know that also the other guidance, the estate regeneration guidance, says everything that's in estate regeneration needs to go through the viability route to be, so that all schemes like that are covered. Are there any schemes, therefore, that would receive grant where you wouldn't get that transparency and testing of the viability route as a result of this change? Because that is my concern, is that we're spending money on something that isn't being looked at in detail because they're meeting your threshold.
Yeah, so what we've intended to do is to enable schemes that provide a high level of affordable housing to follow the fast track route, so that they gain the benefits of that and applicants are incentivised to provide more affordable housing than they would do otherwise. Now, my understanding is that the system outside London works slightly differently, in that applicants are required to secure planning consent and then seek grant over and above that. The problem with that approach is that incentivises applicants to reduce the affordable housing that they provide through the planning system in order then to be eligible for more grant. And so what we're trying to do is bring the two systems together so that there is an incentive to not provide 35% but 40% with grant for private land, 50% public land industrial. So that is the planning aspect of the process. And largely that's reflecting on our experience of dealing the viability tested route, both before the SPG and afterwards, that if an applicant has decided to follow the viability tested route, and then they'll be subject to perhaps mid-term reviews for large schemes, but late reviews as well, almost certainly they will come in with a much lower affordable housing offer. So there's a significant disincentive from our perspective and from planning authorities' perspective to force applicants to follow the viability tested route where they otherwise wouldn't have to. The checks and balances on the grant availability, however, are in place through the grant allocation system, and that's all set out in the capital funding guide.
That's what I've been cross-checking it with, to say with some difficulty. And it's very discretionary. They can check out anything they want to, but it's also on a completely confidential basis as well. So yeah, I'm not convinced, because obviously the report from the audit office on the government spending of grant wasn't particularly happy about how transparent we were being in London, if that makes sense. And I worry that this might be a reduction in transparency.
Well, it's always been the case, even before our new guidance, that schemes, if they commit unconditionally to the fast-track threshold level, can follow the fast-track route because of the overall benefits to the planning system and securing more affordable housing. Just in terms of what the capital funding guide says for the new affordable homes programme, so it also includes the 40% minimum requirement by habitable room. There's also a requirement that the grant is available above 35%, and only if an applicant is seeking a higher proportion of grant do they then have to provide additional information, but that information is provided and that goes to the relevant area team in housing and land, and they will be doing cross-checks against other schemes to look at the rate per unit that's being proposed. This is slightly out of our area of expertise, yes. But we have worked closely with that team in developing this guidance to ensure those checks and balances are in place.
Yeah. And so to ask Jules, you're confident that you've taken into account all the issues raised in the audit process and make sure that everything is...
Yeah, we're as confident as one can.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're confident as one can be, but as I say, it's always been a trade-off. The approach to secure a greater amount of affordable housing than the viability route does throw up, and I don't think we can really base I understand what you're saying about the transparency that you would gain going through a viability route, allegedly, but that route consistently does not throw up a higher amount of affordable housing. So I think we can be absolutely confident that we're getting a sort of more bang for our buck in terms of the return in affordable housing against grant.
Okay, I'll move on. So the threshold approach was very novel at the time, and we were very interested in it as a committee, and we were very, we were. I think I can't speak for everybody, but quite impressed to see that it is pushing things up, that people are taking advantage of that. Obviously, also impressed by the ease with which they would do it, because previously they'd been crying that they couldn't possibly provide one more affordable home to us. So we know that 35%, and we talked about it with the previous deputy mayor at the time, was a guess. It was like let's see if this helps, because it is obviously significant more than what we were getting. It comes out of this process as the same number though. So to what extent have you got evidence for this threshold being right, given it would be a very lucky guess to have got it right the first time as an experiment?
I'm not sure who said lucky guess the first time.
I don't think. I mean, they didn't present us with it was like, let's try this. Was more or less what people told us.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the very first time someone came up with a figure, someone probably had to put a pin somewhere. But after that moment, and before it was introduced, it was informed by analysis of past completions and approvals, and so a judgment was taken as to whether it was that was the ballpark as a result of those completions and approvals. There was viability testing carried out in support of the London plan as well, and that testing concluded that the threshold levels were appropriate. So it's had that second go round the houses on a kind of a sense check of it. And that examination in public and the approach was considered to be appropriate by the inspector. Obviously, this time round, we've had to consider recent market conditions. Yes, greater numbers of developers have taken the fast track route. I think we're up to sort of 66% now are choosing to take that route. So on the one hand, that does suggest, well, perhaps we ought to be looking at raising it, but then looking at the market conditions currently and the amount of uncertainty, both in terms of building cost inflation and the issue around staircases, for example, and these kind of knocks to certainty in the industry. If we were to raise it, now would not be the time, and I think we need to go around the loop again to look at it, and obviously always keep it under review, but the particular market conditions now for the foreseeable, the rest of this year at least and into next year, until there's a significant market recovery and more certainty on issues like staircases, I think it would have to be a serious, any full review would have to take place after that.
Go on.
Sorry, I think that was very well summed up, and I haven't got much to add. But I think John mentioned earlier it's about balance, and at this time, you wouldn't want to give anything that provided any sort of negative market response, meaning that more schemes follow the viability tested route, and that's the concern. Because if you push more schemes through viability tested route, we go backwards a little bit in time, and we know that we get less affordable housing. So I think that's the decision we've made at this time, and the review point is really key. Nobody has suggested this is the absolute end of being able to review that, and there may be times in the future where we should look again.
Would you give us an approximate date at which the committee might once again look at that and try and suggest an increase?
I think it is very hard to determine that at the time with market conditions, and we would, I suppose, be looking to... We're already gathering certain amounts of London plan evidence. I'm sure you've seen things like the Planning for London programme, and we will have to start thinking about things like housing need and capacity across London in the coming few years. And that's probably about as specific as I could get at this point.
Okay. Thank you very much. And then my final question, because I've covered the bullet points underneath this final question, Chair, is about speed. Because one of the goals, I think, of the fast track route by its name is to speed things up. We're looking at the annual monitoring report and looking at 2019-20, for example, 8,391 affordable homes were completed in that year, and obviously speeding things up to completion is the goal here. Do you have any evidence that the process has speeded things up?
Yeah, absolutely. With the fast track schemes referred to the Mayor in 21 and 22, analysis of those showed that they progressed on average 4 months quicker than viability tested schemes. Applications assessed under the viability tested route schemes, those schemes took on average nearly a third of the time longer than fast track route schemes to progress to stage 2. And it's particularly in that bit that it
Can you explain what stage 2 is for
well, between the stage 1 report and stage 2, because remember
this is the planning process, not the completions. That's what we're asking.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm talking about, because that in fact actually kind of beat me to it.
Okay, carry on.
That obviously housing completions are a completely different issue to what this can deliver. This is shortening the planning stage, whereas obviously you can have a big gap between securing planning permission and actually starting on site and delivery. So what we can shorten here is the bit particularly between stage 1 and stage 2 reports.
And and you aren't collecting evidence on how much is being delivered on the ground, if that's coming through more quickly, because obviously there are fewer in the viability tested scheme of things. There's also further reviews. There's continuing work that needs to be done with your team if you're on the viability tested route versus the fast track route.
Well, and any scheme that's been through the fast track route would end up having, well, a lot of them would have this 4 months, statistically would have this 4 months shaved off their timescale.
Okay, that's all I can get out of them, I think, Chair. Sorry.
I mean, John will have to happily expand.
I'm going to pass over to Assembly Best, just because we do have quite a lot to get through still in this section.
Thank you, and apologies, I'm going to pick up a couple of supplementaries on that bit, if that's okay as well. When we're comparing the affordable housing figures going back, say, through the years, back through the previous mayoralty or the previous mayor and then this mayor, one of the things our current mayor will say is that the figures aren't comparable because of the fact that the previous figures had 80% market rent and the affordable definition has now changed, so we're not able to compare those figures. But when we're talking about how successful it's been, it is quite important that we do try to some degree to see how we've elevated affordable housing delivery, because the only figures that we have available tell us there hasn't been much difference in the affordable housing as an average that's approved. Obviously, the definition of what's been approved is different. So is there any way to collate that information to make it clear what's being approved, what percentage of affordable housing is of the previous mayoralty was at a certain level, and that we can try and compare it to the data we have now? Because the only comparison we have, the mayor tells us we can't compare, which then makes it very hard to scrutinise whether it's a success or not. Does that make sense? I don't think I explained it well, but...
Yeah, thank you. And I think this speaks also to the previous question, which I was going to come back on. You're right that the tenures have changed, and we've moved away from affordable rent to up to 80% of market rents. We have the Mayor's preferred tenures social rent, London affordable rent, which is much more affordable than affordable rent, plus the intermediate tenures, within intermediate rent, the London living rent is the preferred tenure, and the rents for that are set out by the Mayor annually, so the benchmarks are set for each individual ward, and then we also have shared ownership as well. So you're right that there's been a qualitative difference in the type of affordable housing that does make comparison different, but needs to be taken into account. Notwithstanding that, the figures I have here are that the overall percentage has increased. I've talked about for referable applications, but it has increased in terms of overall approvals. I think we were around about the 14% figure in 2014, and notwithstanding the issues around what I mentioned about small sites not having to provide affordable housing schemes with permitted development rights, the figures are now in the sort of mid to high 20s. So it takes some time
but then that's because the figures of the total housing approved is much lower. Do you see what I mean? So the average years between 2011 and 16 were 10,507, and between 2016 and 21 were 10,995. So it's a very small difference in the amount of affordable housing. But what's happened is during 2011 to 2016, there was 42,554 homes on average, compared to 2016-21, 33,380 on average. So that's why the percentage looks higher. But I'm not trying to dig. What I'm saying, is that if we're comparing something different, which I agree we are, that we've changed the boundaries of where affordable is, then can we try and get data that allows us to really see whether the Mayor's approach to affordable housing has been successful? Because if I look at those numbers, the answer's no. But if I have all the detail of the differences in what we're approving, then the answer would be yes. But you're telling me that the percentage of affordable housing's increased when we're approving less homes. That doesn't really shout success. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, but I think it is significant because planning authorities can only deal with what is in front of them, and if we had the same percentages that were secured in the early years being applied to those lower numbers, then the overall level of delivery would be substantially lower than where we were previously, and where we are now as well. So, and that to some extent is a factor of the market. In 2016 we had the Brexit referendum. We've had a number of market issues over the last couple of years, as Jules mentioned, uncertainty around fire safety, 2 staircases, issues around bill cost inflation, increases in interest rates as well. So all of that at the moment, the market is cyclical by its nature, and the policies have been designed to try and get the maximum amount of the system wherever the market is. And that is really what controls the number of applications that come in and the number of applications that get converted into completions. We just don't have the powers to enforce a developer to start and complete a development. We can grant planning consent or not. In terms of the breakdown of tenure, I think we could look at that in further detail and see if we can provide some further information on that. Certainly in terms of the referable applications, we've done some monitoring on that, and the proportion of social and low-cost rent units has increased. So and the overall number has increased as well. As I say, the data's not quite as good when you look at the overall London picture because of the time lag that we have and the reliance on information coming from boroughs. Also, I think that means that there are some gaps within that data as well. So there's a bit more of a kind of health warning attached to that information.
Thanks. A question we're looking, obviously coming on from Sean's previous question around completions for affordable housing. I'm still trying to get an answer or understand, how does the GLA define a start? Because I'm concerned that we're having a rapid acceleration of starts, but is that affecting the amount of completions? Because how do you designate a start? Are people being encouraged to start projects, but not if they spend more time starting in different sites instead of just finishing them? That'd be a concern. How does the GLA define a start?
Well,
housing rather than me, but if you can answer it.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a planning perspective, there are starts and completions figures within the annual monitoring report. A start, for the purposes of a Section 106 agreement, there's a legal definition of implementation. That means that the requirements in the Section 106 start to kick in. So means that the planning permission has been implemented. It's legally valid planning permission from that point onwards. It doesn't lapse after 3 years, and the initial obligations kick in. So that's the definition we use in the world of planning. In terms of starts moving on to completions, that will depend on each individual development and how long it takes to build that out. And we deal with a very wide range of schemes, single phase schemes which just meet the threshold to be referable to the mayor, and then very large long-term phase schemes which by their nature do take a long time to build out. And that is monitored by the boroughs, and the information is provided annually through their annual surveys and comes back to us through the data hub.
Thanks. The new London Plan guidance, was there any opportunity within that to give a greater prominence to family-sized homes or larger buildings to correct some of the 2017 housing assessment excessive weighting to 1 and 2 bedroom properties?
To some extent, well, to the most extent, we're constrained by the policy of the London Plan when we produce guidance. So we cannot stray beyond the existing policy to create new policy, because we would be in the grounds of legal challenge. And so from the point of view of including further requirements in terms of size mix, we're not in the realms of being able to do that. So we rely on the existing H10 policy that's currently in the London Plan.
Thanks. And will there still be a separate housing strategy for 21 to 26 for the Affordable Homes Programme, or will this effectively become that strategy?
So there is separate funding guidance, which is for the 2021 to 26 Affordable Homes Programme. That was published at the beginning of that period. But that's for the purposes of the Mayor's funding powers. This is a planning guidance, so is separate. And the Mayor's housing strategy from 2018 is still in place. I'm not aware of any plans to update that, but if we find that is the case, then we can confirm that.
Thank you. And why is the London affordable rent not eligible for grant funding under the new AHP and no longer the Mayor's preferred tenure?
Well, it's really been superseded. I mean, London affordable rent was brought in when the Mayor came in 2016 as a response to where we found ourselves with the old-fashioned affordable rent product being the tenure that could receive government funding. The Mayor managed to secure agreement with government, or that it fell. The ability to fund London affordable rent, those lower rents, rented properties and their creation, that could be secured under the previous funding regime, the 1823 programme. But the new programme, the Mayor has secured agreement with the government that social rent and London living rent can be funded from the grant programme. So they've effectively superseded LAR. So you've got social rent, which is lower than LAR, and then you've got London living rent, which is higher. So it would be kind of almost a duplication, although albeit that LAR would be still a bit higher than social rent. So effectively, and it still is obviously a preferred tenure within the London plan. So if someone comes forward with LAR, it still can be considered to be policy compliant, but the Mayor is just choosing not to fund that. So it's not preferred in terms of the funding regime, but it's still an acceptable tenure to bring forward as part of the scheme.
Okay. The list of schemes not eligible for the fast track routes being expanded to include co-living schemes. Could you expand on the rationale for that?
It hasn't. The viability tested route was always something that co-living schemes would have to go through under the London plan, which is policy H16. That's testing me now. So that it hasn't been expanded. It's just a reference to the existing position.
So the co-living schemes were previously not eligible for the fast track route. That's right. Okay. And final question from me. There are over 100 key worker occupations listed in the list. What criteria are local authorities expected to use to prioritise?
Go ahead. Oh, sorry, I couldn't tell whether you wanted to speak or I was going to speak.
Well, so what we're doing is encouraging councils to bring forward a process of prioritising key workers, but within that quite broad list. I'm not sure that there is, within the Mayor's guidance, a specific framework for sub-categorisation or sub-prioritisation. The intention is that list, which was drawn up in consultation with councils and trade unions, that anyone on that list would be eligible under the key worker criteria. Now, that doesn't mean that non-key workers wouldn't be eligible, but there's a 3-month period in which the prioritisation would be given to anyone within that category. And I think it was intentionally drawn wide so as not to exclude occupations which are still significant and important to London's functioning.
Should there be some further priority, or just to say even that this is for local authorities to prioritise as need may vary, depending obviously on the industry. If you've got one of the a big hospital, for example, near to one scheme, or a different sector, then you may wish to vary the list. So should that be clear?
I think that's the key point, that there should be an ability for this local variation. My hesitation in answering your question originally was because the allocations document that we reference is a housing and land document, and I don't want to speak out of turn in terms of not having the full information. But you're absolutely right there. There's going to be major local differences, and you would want the local authority to embed that within their eligibility criteria as they have it, because some will have existing eligibility criteria regardless of key workers that are to do with local connections, and to become too prescriptive about that could be problematic, as you say, if you have a hospital versus another subset of key workers that live in a particular area. So that would be a kind of where we drew the line, I think, to get that balance.
Sorry, but is it clear to local authorities that they can make their own prioritisation?
I hope so. That's what the objective of the document is. So it should be clear that we are suggesting that the prioritisation should be there, but how they implement that eligibility criteria is down to them. I also think there's a line in there that talks about how they themselves can define it. I don't know the exact line if you've got it there.
Yes. So the guidance says, and this cross-references to the key worker practice note, that the GLA encourages local authorities and housing providers to consider local need when prioritising key workers. This may entail adding to the GLA's core list and or prioritising certain key worker occupations. So it's there. Yeah.
I think also another point is this is the consultation stage, so we are really keen to find out if there are things in there that don't seem clear, and our next engagement event this month actually is with the boroughs, so those are the types of things that we'll be raising and trying to kind of discuss in the round.
Thank you, Senator Best. And I think that is a really interesting point, because I think it'd be fascinating to see what kind of criteria different councils use to be able to have their own local need assessment and prioritisation within that list. So I don't know what appropriate follow-up would be, but I'd be certainly, and I think it sounds like other members would be as well, interested to see which boroughs begin to develop that criteria and share that, and almost see how that plays out. Thank you. Okay, over to Assembly Member Boff. It's having a comeback on the Planning Regeneration Committee.
I was just...
You didn't even leave, did you?
I didn't really, no. No, it's like a dog returning to its sick. It's... I was just curious what was said earlier about the... did I hear right that 30% of Londoners are key workers? What did I hear there? Is that correct?
That's my understanding from the Housing and Land document and research.
Okay. It's a lot of people, isn't it? Yeah. Makes you wonder why it's necessary. Anyway, the draft LPG sets out some clear criteria that that build-to-rent schemes can meet to qualify for the fast-track route. How was that threshold decided?
So similar to the threshold we've discussed previously, and it is the same thresholds, 35% and 50% public land and industrial. And that was then subject to viability testing, considered as part of the examination in public. There are some differences for build to rent because those schemes tend to be owned in single management, and so there isn't a set requirement to sell the affordable units to a registered provider, which will require separate cores, separate blocks. That does happen in some schemes, so the affordable housing tends to be intermediate tenure, but effectively it is the 35 and 50%, so there is some parity across the different sectors.
So that was the intention, to get that kind of parity, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How do you propose the proposals set out in the Development Viability LPG ensure that the process is transparent, and more accessible? I think half the reason we got this session is because we don't think it is. So how do we make it more transparent?
Thank you. So the 2017 guidance set out explicit requirements on councils and applicants around transparency, because that was a very considerable issue in previous years. I've said elsewhere that I'm used to seeing reports with private confidential marked on the FEAs, and they weren't subject to external scrutiny, and that meant that effectively, if there were some issues with the viability testing, it was hard to discuss those issues publicly. And I remember certain cases where in my previous authority we received letters from international law firms threatening to do terrible things if we published the information. So what the guidance did in 2017, we're carrying that over, and this is 2.4 in the new guidance, is to say that boroughs should routinely publish the viability information alongside the other application documents, and that there is a presumption in favour of disclosure, and only if an applicant makes a robust case that individual aspects of the information shouldn't be made available, and that past certain tests should that information not be provided. And those tests are based on the Environmental Information Regulations and Freedom of Information Act. So it's a test of public interest and harm. And so that process should be gone through before there are any redactions or any information is not made publicly available. So this has become a more significant issue over the last couple of years. A number of cases went to the Information Commissioner and to the First Tier Tribunal. Generally speaking, they found in favour of publishing the information. I think the claims that all of the information was confidential hasn't really stood up to scrutiny, partly because a lot of the information is actually in the public domain already, or it isn't specific to the developer. And therefore, if it's a market-based assessment, then that shouldn't cause harm to them and wouldn't meet the public interest test to not provide that. So we did do some monitoring on this with boroughs a couple of years ago and found that the majority of them were routinely publishing viability information as part of the application process. So we do think there's been a significant change in that over the last couple of years. There was also a High Court case in Hackney a year or two ago where legal challenge was brought and a permission was found to be unlawful because not enough information was made available. So it is a significant point, and we think there has been a lot of progress over the last couple of years, certainly compared with the pre-2017 era before this guidance was in place.
Good. I think every now and then this committee gets what it wants, and I think that was something that from all sides we were pushing for. So that's good. Is it still monitored, though? Are we still monitoring? It would just be interesting to see how many applications are going through that aren't 100% transparent. Is that something you monitor?
Yeah, so we convened the London authorities.
You said about 2 years ago you did something 2 years ago, but is it a routine to do that? We haven't asked that question of boroughs because our assumption has been once those processes are in place, they will stay in place. We do convene the London Authorities Viability Group, and that provides a forum for us to ask these kinds of questions. And if that's a concern that may have stopped, we can ask that question again. I think it would be handy for the boroughs just to routinely record it. If it's not a big thing, if it's a checkbox, then why not? Because I do think it's something we want to keep our eyes on, because we're very disturbed. We have been very disturbed about the levels of transparency in the past on some quite significant schemes. The LPG includes, of course, as we've heard, guidance on the principles for undertaking viability assessments. That are significantly more detailed than the previous iteration in the SPG in 2017. Why is it that much more detailed?
So the guidance is more detailed, and the reason for that is that a stronger framework that should mean that financial viability assessments meet basic standards when they're first submitted should actually speed up the process and make it easier for LPAs and the GLA when reviewing these viability assessments to do that more quickly. It also means that it comes back to what you were talking about in terms of transparency. It means that if somebody goes to look for a viability assessment, it should contain all the information that they need to see for them to draw their own conclusions about whether it's robust.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good answer, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Boff. And over to yourself, Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. So the Mayor has called the viability tested route protracted. Does the draft LPG make it less so? And if so, how?
I think that comes back to my answer to the previous question. It's around setting the process and expectations out clearly at the start, so that hopefully all assessors will follow them and it will actually make the process quicker. I think what potentially has been happening is viability assessments don't contain all the information to support inputs, which means that local authorities need to go back and ask for more information. It just makes the whole process much longer than it needs to be.
So as long as everyone's clear about what needs to be put in each time, then that should just smooth it all out.
It should speed up the process, but obviously not as quick as the fast track approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So next question is, the viability LPG includes guidance on sense checking, which I think is very sensible. As you've outlined, sometimes things that clearly don't make sense are thrown up. But how how will this be measured? Can this be measured? Obviously, because it relies on an assessor's sort of understanding of the general picture of things. And if sense checking does indicate that something has gone wrong, where is that then taken?
So this will always have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, because there will always be a different approach taken. The site in question may not always have been sold recently. There may not be relevant comparable evidence. But what it does enable us to do is to look more closely at the market alongside viability assessments as they come forward, and begin to build a picture about what land prices for land should be, where policy requirements are being met, and just gradually build up a wider database that will be in the public domain and accessible to all assessors. So hopefully that moves us towards a more robust process. But it will come down to professional judgment, and that's also why we've cross-referenced it with the RICS guidance, requiring assessors to act in a professional manner.
So that sense checking will be about, because it sort of says based on the experience in the market. So obviously, some comparison with existing market, but are there other elements that might be thrown up on the sense checking in terms of the information that's been put in potentially by?
I think what it enables the assessor to do is to look at the application before them and say, does this make sense in the wider market? So, for example, in areas like Barking and Dagenham, where there's a lot of sites coming forward, and a number of sites will have sold, when an assessment comes forward, if it doesn't seem to clearly reflect the assumptions that must have been made when those prices were paid for that land and those consents were granted and construction started on site, it enables somebody to check that back. I suppose it stops outliers where assessments include assumptions that are not reasonable.
But, sorry, my follow-up was, are there elements that are included in that sense checking that are separate from the market, i.e. some of the information that's been put in that may not be?
And it should all be market-based. Yeah. So the whole kind of what sits behind viability assessments is they need to be fully justified by market transactions, and that includes sales values, construction costs. Yeah, that's what I was sort of talking. So not just the land value, but other elements that are put into viability. Are those part of the sense checking process so I suppose,
as well?
What you might say that if somebody has paid £10 million for a site, and the assessment in front of you says the land value is £1 million, in buying that site, different assumptions may have been made in terms of values, profit, costs. That may be then appropriate to be applied to the application in front of you.
No,
Sorry,
I know. No. You are, but you keep expanding on the same question. And what I'm saying is the other elements that go into land to the viability assessment. So it's not just the original value or the existing land value of the land. It's other elements. Is it viable? How much money is going to be made? Are they subject to the assessors sort of, hold on a minute, that figure looks a little bit odd, and what would you use in order to sense check that? Other market, sort of the prices for other services or construction costs and all that sort of stuff, is all that up for grabs, really?
So sales values obviously would be evidenced by local market transactions, ideally, but in an area where there's not been much new development, not much kind of new flatted development, you might look elsewhere in London to evidence the values that will be achieved on that site, even if there's no directly comparable schemes. And in terms of construction costs, there is more information available now in terms of schemes coming forward and the cost of delivering those schemes. There's various databases, but also viability reviews are starting to throw up information about the actual cost of delivering schemes.
And the rest of that question was, what will happen if there is something is thrown up through sense checking?
Then the borough's assessor or our team can go back and say that can't be right, and would at the very least suggest some sensitivity testing to make sure that you can look at the outcomes in different scenarios, and then the decision maker can take that into account. So, for example, if you did achieve £700 a square foot in Barking and Dagenham, the affordable housing that could be provided would be 40%, and that can be taken into account.
So that could be a basis to reject. Is that what you're saying? Is that the aim of it?
It helps in terms of the working out the weight you've given to a viability assessment.
Okay.
There have been any number of instances where what's typically happened is that their viability assessment has shown a huge deficit, meaning that on a late stage review we would see absolutely no increase in the amount of affordable housing.
Yeah.
And John and Jane and the team have been able to completely eradicate the deficit, and they've had to and so effectively rebased it so that in any late stage review, any increase in value, we would actually see a commensurate increase in the amount of affordable housing that the development supplied.
So it's more, it gives a stronger hand to the discussions at different stages of that development. Okay, thank you. And my last question is about the data hub. I don't think we've had this question answered, so just checking. So the draft viability SPG sets out that Section 106 agreements should require reporting of information to the Planning London Data Hub, which I'm sure would be delighted about. But up until now, have you seen an improvement in the level of reporting to the Data Hub? How are we doing, basically?
So the Data Hub is relatively new,
Yes.
But before that we had the London Development Database, so it's a slightly new system. I think the intention is for the information to be more digitalised, so come through the application process. Our colleagues in our planning support team is working to get that up and running with boroughs and get that as efficient as possible. I know there were a few issues over the pandemic period when the information wasn't being collected, so some data gaps which are being filled. But I think we are filling some of those gaps, and the information is becoming more up to date, notwithstanding that kind of inherent time lag that always applies over and above the figures that we can assess on our referable applications.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Committee, I'm looking to close this section by 3:30. I know you had a follow-up, Assemblyman Berry, and then I had a couple, so hopefully we can get that squeezed in.
Great. It just goes in at the end of this section, I'm afraid. It's not really a follow-up to anything.
Go for it.
I'm afraid. It relates to our other investigation on embodied carbon and carbon and that kind of thing. I noticed that refurbishment doesn't get much of a mention in the viability guidance. There's a few lines about whether or not, hang on, let me get this right. It says 4.4.22, if an applicant proposes to use the refurbishment of existing buildings as a basis for establishing benchmark land value, this should be assumed to be an alternative use value and assessed accordingly. Have you done anything to make it easy or helpful to assess the viability of refurbishment projects within this guidance? Or is the assumption, as I kind of saw there, that the most existing buildings will be knocked down?
I'll start and then pass over to you. So the policies in terms of estate regeneration within the London Plan do have that test about determining whether a scheme should be refurbished before being demolished and rebuilt. So this guidance doesn't change that. That's still part of the London Plan, still part of the policy. I think you're mentioning the approach in the viability guidance around determining benchmark land values and the approach where an existing use is refurbished. The point that we're getting at, and this is actually reflected in national guidance, is that a assessor should not inflate the benchmark land value, which has an effect of reducing affordable housing, by assuming that the existing use can be refurbished and then apply a premium on top of that. What we're saying is that an alternative use valuation should be taken, and importantly under national guidance and our guidance, no premium can be applied to that. So this is a mechanism to ensure that land values aren't inflated through a hypothetical assumption of refurbishment, which would have the impact of reducing affordable housing.
Okay, I'm just thinking though that in general we've had this problem with, there's all kinds of stuff in here to check that they're not inflating their development costs, that they're not, they're not trying to convince you there's nothing left for affordable housing in ways that are not legitimate. And we want to see, generally the world wants to see more reuse of buildings in general, not just estates, but also industrial, commercial premises. We've got a carbon battle. And I read this through and I can't see much guidance that would lead to you scrutinising those schemes in the same way as you do normal, as in, more conventional things where you're just considering the site as land rather than an existing set of buildings that might be improved instead of knocked down. Does that follow? Have you spent much time looking at refurbishment schemes and how you would assess their viability?
Yeah, I mean, we do get some schemes where it may be entirely refurbished floor space or part change of use, for example. I mean, it partly depends what you require planning permission for, and of course, if you can do something through permitted development rights, it won't come through the planning process. But where we do get schemes that follow the viability tested route and there's an element of, say, change of use, that would follow the same route. It would the same scrutiny and guidance would apply to that in terms of looking at costs and values and maximising the affordable housing provision. And similarly, if the scheme could provide the threshold level, it wouldn't need to be viability tested, but it doesn't change the approach. I mean, it would have an impact on build costs, and I guess... Yeah,
I mean, they're very different schemes. That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah,
so the benchmarking might be more difficult. They could get away with more in terms of saying we can't afford to provide affordable housing.
So I think if it was a refurbishment scheme, you look at the existing use value of the building. Say it was a very scruffy residential building. You look at the existing use value of that, and then you look at the costs of refurbishing that building, and then the value of that building at the end of the day after you've done your refurbishment. So it'd be exactly the same process. I think the section of the guidance you're referring to is where you look at an alternative use value, a refurbishment as an alternative use value, and then comparing that with the new scheme. So I think the approach set out does enable you to do that comparison between a refurbishment and a knock a building down and build a new development. Because in both cases you're looking at this is what happens if you do the refurbishment, and this is what happens if you knock it down. So I think the basis is balanced between the two. But I think it's right, there is more emphasis in the guidance towards complete redevelopment. So that's something we could look at.
Just, I don't want to waste too much time, but Jules, you're happy this is future proof once we start to see more and more refurbishment schemes coming through?
Well, as Jane says, it's out for consultation. As Jane says, it's out for consultation. We can take a look at this, but it's the guidance is deliberately a kind of a web document that we can update, and Lisa Fairmanner has been clear that that this effectively these documents are live and evolving. We don't want to keep changing them because that's going to add uncertainty to people, but where we need to change them, we will. So.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I mean, the main problem we have with refurbishments is that they're often waved around as not viable, and we question whether they might actually be viable. So it's another different issue altogether.
No, I think it's an interesting follow-up, and I imagine it is likely to feature in our response to the consultation, so thank you for raising it. Just to close this section, I just wanted to be sort of slightly, if you don't mind and can indulge me, tangential, and just wanted to ask a kind of broader question on even before I joined the Assembly, sometimes I found the viability assessment a process that was frustrating, witnessing a protection of profit in law, which I think the threshold and the fast-track route has done a great job to mitigate in London against. But I think I just wanted to ask if you feel like the percentage of profit protection within the viability assessment is appropriate. I don't know if appropriate is the right word. If you had the pen and paper for national reform, would you change it? And I think in the context of the LEB happening at the moment, if there are other aspects of the viability assessment on a national level you would change. For instance, we talked about the land value and how that's caused problems in the past, and using existing use value as a more effective way of measuring. So I just wanted to open up a little bit more of a creative, broad question to anyone who wanted to respond.
Shall I deal with the profit points? So the LPG does not set out a prescriptive range in terms of profit, whereas national guidance does set out a range of 15 to 20%. That is for plan testing, not for application stage testing. I think that's often muddled up. What we're saying in the guidance that the profit needs to be evidence-based, and there will be different profit requirements for different types of development coming forward. So for estate regeneration, because there's less risk, it's likely to involve the public sector, which suggests there'd be a significantly lower profit requirement there. Or another example may be where a commercial occupier and landowner are re-providing their accommodation and building new housing. Then again, there's much less risk. They know that the new store will be occupied by them ourselves. So the guidance talks about it needing to be evidence-based in all case rather than broad brush percentages, because we don't think that's a helpful approach.
Just in terms of national guidance, so national guidance does now include the existing use value approach plus, which is helpful. I mean, other things we think that could be included are some of the new aspects of our guidance around sensitivity testing, sense checking, just to make sure the approach is objective and robust, to ensure some of those overall principles, like the assessment should be carried out in the public interest. And perhaps a bit more detail on review mechanisms. There is some quite helpful text in the guidance around the principle, but not much detail. But more broadly, we think actually applying something like the threshold approach nationally would make a substantial difference, and potentially could create a situation where additional affordable homes and infrastructure is secured through the planning process outside of London. I know we've spoken in this committee about the infrastructure levy previously, which is currently out to a technical consultation which finishes on Friday. That technical consultation document has raised a range of additional questions, and there is still, perhaps even a greater cross-sector concern around some of those proposals. So, we would advocate, again, retaining and improving the current system, which is well understood, rather than introduce the levy, which we understand will take 10 years to introduce, and go through a test and learn approach prior to that. And the levelling up bill is continuing through Parliament, but we will be engaging in that consultation process, and many others are as well. And then just finally, I think a point about resourcing, that outside of London, councils don't necessarily have the expertise that we have here in the GLA. They don't have a strategic authority who can help with the larger applications, or the networks that we have to share advice and look at some of the really quite technical aspects of this. So, there is scope for substantial improvements if there was extra resourcing and a framework for sharing that information outside of London.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Well, I think it's probably best we wrap up there, unless any of the committee members have a burning follow-up to what we've discussed. But I think we've had a really substantial and informative discussion. I'm really grateful, Jane, John, Jules and Michaela, for your time this afternoon, and I'm sure you'll be eagerly awaiting the committee's consultation response. But please do stay tuned in some form to the next panel as well, because we'll have industry, and we'd want to make sure that you absorb that feedback as well. But thank you again for your time. We're going to adjourn for 10 minutes, so we'll reunite at 42 past. Thanks very much.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Meeting. We will now move on to our second part of the session on the London Plan Guidance on Affordable Housing and Development Viability. Thank you very much for our second panel of guests joining us. I think we have everyone in person who's supposed to be here and our guest on Zoom, so I will introduce them now. So in person today for our second panel of guests, we are joined by Joshua Mouden, Development Viability Manager at Tower Hamlets Council, Rachel Ferguson, Senior Development Manager at Pocket Living, and Anthony Lee, Head of UK Development Viability at BNP Paribas Real Estate. Online we have Dinah Roke, who's the Chair of the London Housing Panel, and I think should probably pop up on our screen any moment now.
Just ask them to put her up.
Just ask them to put her up. Great.
She's on there, but
lovely. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us. I saw some of you were here in part and in full for the first part of this session where we were evidence gathering from officers and our Deputy Mayor, and I hope you can agree it was an informative panel, and some of our panel have remained to stay tuned into your feedback, because obviously in industry or in the council it's really important for us to hear how you found this guidance, both the 2017 SPG but what you can hope from this guidance as well in draft form at the moment. So I'm going to start with the questions and I'll move on to my committee members, but just to confirm from committee services, Diana can hear us?
She's on it.
I can hear you.
Lovely. Oh, there you go. Fantastic. Okay, so we'll start with to what extent, and this is open to all panel guests, so please just indicate when you want to come in, to what extent do you think the draft LPGs will meet their intended aim of increasing the delivery of affordable homes in London? Fantastic. Anthony, why don't you start, and I'm just going to go along this way on the panel to stop any shy contributions.
So it's red?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think what the guidance does in a positive way is to give clarity to developers as to how both the GLA will assess viability, but also how local authorities should assess viability. So in that respect, as Jane Seymour mentioned earlier, there is clarity around benchmark land value, and that's a key point that's been contested and debated since 2012. So going back to that point, you may have discussed this, and I wasn't in the first session, but the government at that time effectively ceded control of the ground rules on viability to the development industry and the RICS, and they, frankly, with greatest respect to them, made some mistakes in terms of allowing market value to be the benchmark, and there were all kinds of problems with that you may have already discussed, but we can discuss those later if we need to. But the current guidance from your officers, the draft guidance, gives clarity around existing use value. That's helpful in terms of developers knowing what land value they should be allowing in assessments, and that really helps you as an authority to secure the maximum uplift above existing use value towards affordable housing. On the flip side to that, it's important to recognise that ultimately the economics of development are what they are. There will be different existing use values on different sites. They will vary. Some will be low, some will be high. And then the cost of bringing forward schemes will also vary depending on the type of scheme coming forward, and factors around the amount of uplift in floor space that you can achieve on a development. So the ideal scenario would be that you have a single-storey building with low value and you're going up 10, 20 or whatever stories, so the quantum of development is far greater than what's there at the moment. So ultimately the guidance helps give clarity, but it won't necessarily drive more affordable housing, because that's down to how viability pans out on individual sites.
Okay, that was very helpful, thank you. Although obviously clarity can lead to more affordable housing because it adds to certainty.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Anthony. Rachel, did you want to come in?
Yes, I'm from Pocket Living and we're an SME developer, and our majority of our schemes today have tended to provide 100% affordable housing, albeit largely all of the intermediate tenure. So in the majority of instances, we seek to follow the fast-track route, and definitely welcome that the guidance this time round acknowledges that where there's more than 75% affordable housing proposed, that there will be discretion as to the tenure mix. But we still find in a lot of instances we have long debates with local authorities as to whether we still need to be viability tested. And I think the main bit from our side, and particularly it's felt across the industry, but especially SMEs, I think, is kind of the protracted nature of viability discussions when we often do end up getting pushed down that route, even when we're more than 75% affordable housing. So I think from our side, anything that gives clarity and helps speed up the process so that we can get through planning quickly definitely helps. So very much welcome that 75% is repeated in the guidance as well as the policies. But I think just to echo Anthony's point really is it being applied consistently between the GLA and local authorities, so we're not getting different approaches, and that often leading to the viability process being extended.
Interesting. It'd be nice to see a fast-tracked version at local council level. Yeah. Joshim.
Yes, I'd add that the enhancement of review mechanisms is probably a very, very useful thing, because a lot of development comes forward over a good period of time, and as discussed earlier, the market and economic change circumstances change. The review mechanisms help capture any additional on-site affordable housing, or indeed a contribution, where it's viability tested, and if it's fast-tracked, then you've got an early stage review that could be enacted if indeed they don't get on site within a set period of time or agreed with the local authority. As well as the guidance around growth testing, sensitivity testing is very useful, because you can kind of look at what the future value would be and what the scheme can deliver over time, and not just at a set point in time. And I think that's of particular value, and I did see that there's numerous formulas, some of which have been added on this time round to capture different types of building types, which weren't there before. we most certainly adopt them, and sometimes, or a lot of the time, if the Section 106 agreement isn't secured well enough or tightly enough, a viability assessment at the application stage could be trumped quite quickly. I did note that in the guidance, there's stuff around the delivery of the affordable housing units itself. At what part of a scheme would it come forward? Not kind of pushed towards the end, which was very useful. And I think that plays a huge role in affordable housing delivery as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Diana.
Hello, so I'm speaking on behalf of the London Housing Panel members, a diverse group of community voluntary sector organisations, and our focus is very strongly on the delivery of social rented housing in the way that actually helps meet the needs, huge and growing needs in London. And it feels as though this guidance will, particularly the affordable housing guidance, but then also the viability work, will increase the amount of affordable housing. And I think our concern is how much will that then flow through into the delivery of social rented housing. We know that the GLAs, this isn't about making new policy, but I think that the certainty that will come through people knowing what effect policies will have on their land values, and the comments earlier that have been made by other participants on the existing use value should help increase the quantum of social rented housing, which is, as I say, the thing that we are most focused on from the community and voluntary sector organisations that are part of the London Housing Panel.
Thank you very much. And I just had a small follow-up. I think it's not necessarily been touched on, but if any of the guests wanted to draw out if they thought that the proposals are an improvement to the process outlined in the 2017 SPG. Anthony.
I don't think they're significantly different in terms of the broad headlines. So the 2017 guidance used the same approach of existing use value plus premium or alternative use value. That's been carried forward into the 2023 draft guidance and is also consistent with the planning practice guidance that came after the 2017 guidance. So in terms of consistency, it's all now aligned, whereas in 2017, the guidance was taking a directly opposite view to government policy or government guidance. There are some items in the guidance that perhaps take things a step further than the planning practice guidance and the 2017 guidance, such as comparisons or cross-checks of residual values against land transactions, which we have particular concerns around, and we can come on to if you'd like to. And also it seeks to limit profits on estate regen schemes, which is another matter of concern of ours, which again we can come on to. But in terms of the broad thrust of the guidance, it's, in my view, fairly similar to the 2017 guidance.
Do feel free to elaborate on your concerns around the estate regen point that you've just touched on. Okay,
I'm happy to deal with that now, if that helps. So it was raised in the end of the last session. So Jane Seymour said there's less risk on estate regen schemes. I think it's important to recognise that the risk is in different parts of the scheme. So on the affordable housing element, that has a lower profit margin than the private housing in any scheme, in any viability. So if you have more affordable housing, then you have more quantum of development with a lower profit margin applied to it. But if you have 50% or 40% of the units as private housing to cross-subsidise the affordable, that has the same sales risk as any other development has. So it's the same risk of selling a private unit on an estate regen scheme as it would be on a scheme that's not an estate regen scheme. But the guidance is seeking to argue that for a local authority or a housing association, that scheme carries less risk, or the sales risk of the private housing is lower. And that is a matter, I think, that some local authorities and some housing associations would disagree with. The risk of selling market housing is the same, regardless of the scheme. So that's something that might, in time, simply disincentivise HAs and local authorities from bringing forward estate regen schemes, and they might choose instead to employ a private sector partner, such as Countryside, because they wouldn't be penalised in terms of having a lower profit margin applied to them by this guidance. So that's my first concern. In terms of the land transactions cross-check, so what the guidance is suggesting is that the output or the residual valuation, and you will have discussed that no doubt in the first session around what that means, and it's essentially the value of the scheme when it's built, less the cost of construction, less the profit margin, less finance and so on. You have an amount left over, the residual land value to pay for the land. It's suggested that that should be compared to what other developers have paid for other sites in other parts of the borough or other parts of London. And there are numerous problems with that. Firstly, that you're trying to compare a different development on a different site with different circumstances. It might have different bulk and massing, different materials, a huge range of different types of circumstances on those sites, and you're comparing what a developer paid for that site to what you think this scheme, with all the detail you've assessed, should be worth. So that's hugely problematic, because you can't get under the bonnet of those land transactions. You simply know the headline number. So as a means of comparison, to test the outcome of the residual valuation, we think that's hugely flawed and difficult.
Thank you, Anthony. I understood your second point around land transaction. Could you just reiterate your first point? Because I'll be honest with you, it didn't sink in.
On estate regen?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So the draft guidance suggests that if you have private housing in a estate regen scheme, and that's fairly typical, that you increase the volume of development to make better use of the land and also to cross-subsidise the redelivery of the affordable. In the appraisal, you'd normally have two profit margins, one for the private housing, another for the affordable. So the affordable profit margin would be lower, so 6% typically, because that is lower risk, because you've got an RP who will come in and buy those units from you at the outset, so there's very little sales risk. With the private housing element, you would typically, as a developer, apply a profit margin of somewhere between 17 to 20% of the GDV to reflect the risk of selling those units. But what the guidance indicates is that when the GLA assesses those schemes, they will seek to apply a lower profit margin to those units than would be the case for a private developer. So if you're a local authority, you may only be allowed to have let's say a 15% profit margin, whereas if you're a private developer, you would be allowed a 17% margin or 18 or whatever it might be. And I think that distinction or that sort of ramping down a profit for certain developers bringing forward schemes, i.e. local authorities and housing associations, will possibly incentivise those bodies to simply say, well, we don't want to take the extra risk because we're not covered for that risk because we're getting a lower profit margin. They will simply say to a third-party developer, if you bring this scheme forward, you will be allowed a higher profit margin than we would. Therefore, you're best placed to absorb that risk rather than us bringing the scheme forward.
Assemblyman Berrier had a clarification.
Yeah, Chair,
please.
can I clarify with you which paragraph it is? Because I read the paragraph I think you're referring to, and I didn't read it that way. Can I read it out and just check? It's 4.3.33, and it says the likely type of developer should also be taken into account. For example, where councils and registered providers bring forward estate regeneration schemes as the lead developer or as part of a partnership, they are able to do so without requiring the levels of returns required by private developers. And these schemes are often supported by grant and other forms of subsidy. The level of return assumed, presumably for the whole scheme in this scenario, should reflect this. So I think they're just referring to the part of the partnership that's the registered provider, rather than saying that the partner should be looking to get a reduced rate of return. I mean, you might want to ask them to be very clear about that, but I'm not sure that you're reading their intentions correctly, to be honest.
Well, if that's the case, then I accept the point, but my reading of that part of the document was that a lower profit would be applied to local authorities bringing forward a scheme than would be the case if it was a private developer bringing forward the scheme. And as you rightly say, that might be a point for clarity when the document's redrafted, to be absolutely clear as to what the intentions are.
Thank you for both for flagging that, and I think that that's been noted for us to go away with. Well, we'll be able to follow up with it. I'm going to pass over to Assemblymember Baker because I think my second question has been answered.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is to this section of the panel. I think, Diana, if you've got anything to add, then please do indicate. First question is, to what extent is the guidance feasible for developers and local authorities to implement, and are there any risks associated with the fast-track route? Does anyone want to...
Thanks. I think it's been followed relatively well over the last 4 or 5 years. I think the additions now wouldn't be very difficult to adopt within local authorities. There was some parts within it where it had additional requirements of monitoring and recording for local authorities, and I think there might just need to be a bit of consideration about resourcing within certain authorities where resources stretched already, having to record and monitor affordable housing numbers and what's gone through fast track and viability test route would be an addition. However, I can see the value in it. We do it currently at Tower Hamlets, but I don't think it's widespread everywhere. And referring to some of the discussions you had before, it does feed into, greater consideration later down the line and what the impact of the threshold approach has had over the last number of years. And your second part was...
So are there any risks associated with the fast track route?
I think at the moment, retaining the 35% is probably a sensible choice. We're in the midst of testing for a new local plan, and we're looking at what number is reasonable. There is obviously ambitions to try and increase where possible. I just don't believe right now may be the correct time, given everything that's happening and has happened. But I guess testing will show further. London-wide, I believe it's still a good incentive. Applications are still coming through at 35%. Mind you, not every single application will come through at 35, but it's definitely a reasonable point where developers just would rather speed the process up, not getting to quite detailed discussion, and get their permission to get on site. I don't think there's a huge risk at this stage, but I can only assume there will probably be some industry suggestions to say market downturn, is a 35% reasonable? And I can probably expect that to happen.
Thank you. Rachel?
I think just to add to that point in terms of the further requirements that the guidance sets out, so I guess additional modelling of the sensitivities, there's a reference to testing other types of typology on the site in instances. As the point Josh has made, very much creating more work for local authorities to need to review, but also for developers and employing their consultants in the first instance. It's just, I think, would be helpful to define a set of criteria that's really essential at the outset of the process, so that we are not creating additional amounts of work that will again prolong the process, both for the developer to compile the information and then for the local authority to have the ability to review it. And I think it's just ensuring that information really is required and proportionate in each instance, and perhaps there's a scale threshold at which point some of that information might be required, whereas on smaller schemes it's not. And again, I appreciate this is for GLA referable schemes, but if local authorities are taking that as a benchmark, so I think that in terms of feasibility, and the point Anthony's already made about looking at the market comparables again, I think would be a concern for us. And then in terms of echoing the point on risk, I think obviously there was a large debate about the 35% threshold when the SPG first came forward, and very much support kind of at least not increasing that position at the moment. I think the main concern at the moment, and perhaps we'll come on to that later on, is just in terms of the current inflationary environment and impact on bill costs. And many developers out there are looking at how they can continue to kind of retain that affordable level or bring forward a scheme in this current build cost environment. And obviously, quite often you're at the point where actually when you submit a viability assessment for planning, it's likely to be at least a good 18 months before you're actually on site building that in instances.
Thanks. Anthony, you've got anything to?
Yeah, just a few points from me. So I think one of the risks is that developers are incentivised to bring forward schemes that they may not be able to deliver because they're not viable on today's basis, and they don't become viable over the life of the planning consent. So in order to circumvent the perceived delay of having viability information submitted, they go with a threshold of 35% and then find they can't bring those schemes forward. So that's a risk. The other risk is that the threshold incentivises developers to treat the affordable housing as a fixed item in the appraisal, and then try and move other things, so bulk and massing and height being a critical one. So you see developers coming forward and saying, well, in order to get to 35% and in order to be fast track, we need an extra 10 stories, 50,000 square metres of space, etc., etc. So you almost then get unacceptable schemes in terms of planning impacts coming forward in order to deliver the 35%. And ultimately, clearly, there's a planning balance between heights, bulk and massing and affordable housing. But inevitably, local authorities, if they're prioritising affordable, may be granting consents that are outside the normal envelope or acceptable envelope for height and bulk.
Okay, thanks. I mean, that raised a whole load more questions that I'd love to ask you, but I think they would cut across Assemblymember Berry's questions, so I will pause there. My second question.
Assemblymember Baker just said Dinah's got her hand
Oh,
as well.
sorry, I beg your pardon.
I just wanted to raise the risk that's been raised by the members of the London Housing Panel, is that we're actually not achieving as high a percentage as we could be achieving. I understand the balance that was put in place in terms of arriving at the 35% figure, and it feels from the evidence that we have on delivery so far as that actually most developers are adapting to that. Landowners similarly are adapting to that in their expectations of land prices that they may be able to achieve. I would suggest that we need to keep that in under review, because potentially that 35% figure could go up.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, my second question is specifically to Joshim. It's about the key workers, the guidance around key workers. Do you think the guidance is clear enough on how local authorities should prioritise key workers?
Yes, I think it does provide freedom for local authorities to look at prioritisation based on their borough. If further clarity could be provided, then great, but I think they get the message. And I think they'll be able to model together what's required for each individual borough. I'm sure that within Tower Hamlets the same thing will probably apply, to see what key workers would be best to look at.
Thanks, that's helpful. Yeah, because I think it's something that I probably get asked about more than anything else. It being something that's there, but actually, you know, how it's delivered is possibly more complex than it seems. So, yeah. That's all from me. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Baker. I'll pass over to Assemblymember Best. Oh,
sorry, me again.
Oh, sorry, no, Dinah. Sorry.
Sorry, Dinah.
Just on the key workers point, because we had a conversation about all this with the London Housing Panel, and the London Tenants Federation raised the point that there are a number of key workers who can only afford social rents in terms of their tenancies, and the assumption that somehow key worker housing will only ever be let at a higher rent should just be challenged and be thought about, but which I think picks up the point that was just made. It's more complicated.
Thank you. Apologies, I keep missing you.
Yeah, that was really helpful, Dinah. Thank you. Over to you, Assemblymember Best.
Thank you. And Rachel, I think you've started to touch on this, so you'll be happy to expand. To what extent will the rising cost of construction impact viability and delivery? And in your view, has this been adequately reflected in the new guidance?
I think to take the first part in terms of rising construction costs impacting viability, absolutely it is, and I think probably over the next few years we'll start to see the knock-on impact on delivery. We've got a number of schemes which are still on site, but a number of schemes which we might have got planning for in the last 6 to 12 months that we've been going out to tender on those, the level of construction price inflation that you're seeing on those projects. And very much the nature of Pocket as a developer, we tend to provide a very specific product for a particular audience, so it might be different to that of other developers who would be going back and looking at reducing their level of affordable housing and trying to amend that, whereas we're pretty much trying to stick with that project. But I think the trouble to a degree is the impact of the time lag, I guess, where you are looking at construction costs at the point at which you're submitting planning compared to the point at which the site comes forward, and whether in the viability analysis you're taking a view on everything based on current day costs and current day values, or whether when you're doing the viability you're looking at the inflation that's applied to that and debates around it. I think probably like for the lifetime of the original guidance, we haven't necessarily had these inflationary pressures, and it's something that's sort of very much become more alive in the last 2 years. And I think it's how is there a scope to review construction, to review the construction costs during that viability process, because ultimately the review mechanisms are just looking for capturing any gain where viability is increasing, but don't allow any scope for negotiation if viability is decreasing, to be able to help schemes going ahead without necessarily having to pause, submit a whole new planning application or Section 73 application to revisit that scheme and keep it going. And I don't think necessarily the guidance was designed with that in mind and necessarily proposes a solution to it, but I think it's certainly a big concern at the moment. And one thing I guess that's interesting that the National Infrastructure Levy is talking about at the moment is actually an upwards and downwards review of viability, which I can hear sniggers because I know there's been a lot of debate about that. But ultimately, at the moment, I think this current position very much focuses on just assuming viability is only ever going to improve and doesn't allow for viability being hindered and that impacting delivery.
Thanks. And I guess that brings us back to the threshold argument as well. I know pocket living's slightly different in that, but whereby do you think that there's enough leeway at all in the thresholds versus viability? Because the thing that hits me is when you have 35% or 50% of nothing, then you have nothing. Is that being adequately addressed within the new guidance, or is there anything that you would like to see that would help?
Yeah, I guess it is very black and white at the moment, the 35% or the 50% threshold. Certainly, if there's some scope, but I guess ultimately at the moment, if you can't hit the fast track route, you're sent down the viability tested route if you can't hit that 35%. If there is a mechanism to, in certain environments or whether certain market forces, to have a look at an earlier review of that 35% threshold and whether that's appropriate in exceptional circumstances, I think that would be welcomed. Certainly on most of our schemes, we're 75%, 80% affordable upwards. So providing we can still operate in that world where the local authority will agree to a fast track, it might be possible to reduce our affordable but still be substantially above that threshold, whereas I guess for other developers, they're already much closer to that balancing line. It's probably a different circumstance.
Anthony, do you want to come back on both of those?
Yeah, I was just going to say that costs are cyclical, and we need to look over a local plan period, and it is entirely possible that by the time we get to the end of the 15-year plan period, things will be different. We simply don't know. But the mechanics of the system in place are able to deal with increases and falls in values and costs in terms of the late-stage review mechanism. The principle has always been in late-stage review that the developer takes the risk of cost increases when they start construction. So that's the reason why they build in that return to their appraisal, because they take on the risk, and ultimately that amount of profit is at risk. If the scheme doesn't deliver as expected, there's no profit. So it's by no means guaranteed. Again, I think in the last session, the phrase profit protection was mentioned. I think it's important to stress that a profit is built into the appraisal at the point planning is granted, at the point viability is assessed. But after that point, profit is entirely at risk. So if costs do increase to such an extent that that profit is entirely eroded by build cost inflation, that's not protected. So developers are taking a risk, and that's why the returns are what they are. What this might do, it might result in some developers thinking, well, we're simply not going to take the added risk of doing 35% that we can't deliver today based on today's viability, in the hope that values will increase to get us to a viable point. They'll simply say, well, we'll go down the viability tested route because we can't feasibly get to 35% with expected cost inflation over the life of the planning permission. So I suspect what we might see going forward is more developers going down the viability tested route and fewer going down the fast track route because of the risk, the added risk of cost inflation.
Just to come back on that, is there anything specifically you'd like to see built into the...
Well, I think ultimately the guidance echoes the London plan, indicating that this is a choice of the developer, what route they go down. I don't think there's any further clarity required in the guidance. It will simply be a matter of the outlook developers take on risk, whether they go down one route or the other.
Thanks, Anthony. And Joshim, do you think the proposed change to the income cap for the London living rent will make it a more viable tenure? And also, earlier we were talking about whether the shared ownership income cap should have risen as well. Did you have any thoughts on that?
I think the increase from 60 to 67, I think, is a reasonable one. I think going to in excess may have made things difficult for the purposes of shared ownership, and not going beyond 90,000 probably is a bit of a stretch, given how things are, and in terms of salaries going up in line with portion of inflation rather than a lot more. It doesn't. I haven't looked at the evidence in terms of incomes within a certain, within our borough or anything, but I think it doesn't look like it would make sense at this stage. I would also add, I think, just as Anthony was talking about, more schemes might proceed through the viability tested route. The good thing there is that whilst construction costs are cyclical, the viability reviews do play a key role in that. With the interest rates continuing to increase to try and suppress inflation, we're going to see quite a bit of a change, and we recently have done so. And it's the job of these reviews to kind of capture what changes take place over time. So that's where I think the guidance will help in terms of the standardised approach and all the other guidance that's been set out within the document.
Thanks. Did anyone else want to come in on that? You don't have to.
I mean, just the obvious point in terms of opening, particularly kind of discount market rent products more coming forward with the growth of build to rent. I think increasing that threshold kind of reflects like the income growth over the period from when the 60k was last set, and certainly kind of opens up the product to more young professionals in the marketplace. So I think from our side, in terms of seeing that increase, we definitely welcome it.
But on that same vein, then, how do you feel about the fact that there's no increase on the shared ownership cap?
We don't provide shared ownership.
But do you have, looking at the market, because surely even to understand that you think that opens up your products, then people that have shared ownership as a main product would be thinking the same as you. Surely. Yeah. Anthony, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in response to that question, increasingly, as a product, shared ownership doesn't work because the incomes people require to afford the
Sorry, which one doesn't? I didn't hit.
The shared ownership product because of the increasing market value. So the 25% initial equity stake that's sold is getting too expensive, and the rent on the retained equity is getting too expensive. So the amount of money you need to be earning is getting increasingly expensive, and it's not targeting the kind of people that Rachel would be targeting in terms of their incomes. So there's a trade-off between the amount people have to pay for their housing product, whether it's rented or intermediate rented, and viability, because the less people pay, the lower the capital value of those units that you put into the appraisal, and therefore the lower the residual value. So there is this trade-off between affordability and viability. So it's a difficult one. You may get more affordable, but it being less affordable to people occupying, or you can get more a lower quantum but more affordable in terms of lower incomes required.
So would you see a change or no?
Well, ultimately, it's a political choice between overall quantum of delivery and affordability. So it's not really something that I can comment on, although clearly the authorities that I work with, they express a preference for truly affordable housing. But that can sometimes come at a cost of a lower quantum.
Thanks. And Anthony, sticking with you, how does a 50% affordable housing threshold on public land impact on viability and the ability to develop homes?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So obviously public land, it depends on the approach taken by the owner of those sites. So if we take an example of TfL, TfL have agreed with the mayor that across their portfolio they will deliver 50% affordable. That has the impact of suppressing the land value ultimately. So there is always a direct trade-off, whether you're a private landowner or public landowner, between land value and affordable housing quantum. So the difference between the two is simply that public authorities are told you must prioritise affordable housing over land value, whereas private developers, to a lesser degree with a threshold route, are allowed to take more land value and slightly less affordable. So the 35% for private landowners versus 50% for public landowners means you get lower land value for the latter than the former. So it's a political and commercial decision by authorities ultimately.
Joshua, did you want to say?
I was just going to add, I think that's right. I think the issue is we've seen schemes come forward on public land that are delivering 50%, and we're currently assessing schemes that are coming forward on public land that are not offering 50% and far below. I believe the wording in the guidance talks about any transactions that are taking place after 2017 or changed hands would be considered public land attracting 50% as a requirement. And sometimes they can be difficult. So it's not always the case that on public land you're getting the full 50, but there have been numerous circumstances where they were delivered at 50 or they came through the fast track approach.
Thanks.
Thank you. I also just wanted to make sure we open up this question to Dinah and Rachel if they wanted to add anything.
We're working with TfL on a number of their car park sites, and I think I would just say, in terms of from that developer perspective, it's very clear at the outset what's expected, and the land value is generated on a basis of you are going to have a 50% or higher level of affordable housing on that site. So I think certainly in terms of having that clear-cut threshold, it provides the certainty when everyone is competing for that land on the market.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm aware because I'm hoping that one of those schemes you might have to revisit because I opposed it.
You're not obliged to comment on that. Diana, I don't know if you wanted to comment on this question. No, brilliant. Well, I'll pass over to Assemblymember Berry then.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd probably start with Joshua on this, if that's okay, because my question's about the usefulness of the new documents. And I think you mentioned earlier on, there's clarity, there's more formulas in it, there's more that you can your local decisions onto as well. Is there anything else you want to say about that sort of side of things? Is there anything else in there that you think is particularly helpful? Or not, as the case may be?
No. I think it has been useful and proved useful for the last 5 years. As I mentioned resourcing earlier, actually, a lot of boroughs adopt the formulas that have been in the SPG previously quite quickly, and I think that's helped them in terms of their resourcing. They don't have a lot of staff on certain teams to kind of look at things in very fine detail. This helps them out, not just with resource but time as well. I think it helps both the public sector as well as the private sector, because they're all kind of looking at the same thing in terms of how they're going to assess viability. And I think that previously, I think it was one of those things where the industry grew over time, recognising the complications of development viability over time, and now it's come to a point where it's reinforcing stuff within the PPG that's currently out there, and kind of learning from what has taken place over the last 5 years to kind of bolster the guidance that's now provided. I can't think of anything in there that has serious concern at this stage, and I believe as and when it's formally adopted, it will be used by us, as well as many assessors both in the public and private sector. But to answer your question, no, I don't think there's anything further.
Okay, thank you very much. Anthony, I wanted to ask you the same question. And also, I think you were saying before that the difficulties that there might be in the market, you know, the world and all of those things, might lead to more people struggling to meet the threshold and using the viability route. Conversely, if the viability route becomes sort of simpler and more consistent and easier to follow, does that mean that more people would just use it anyway? Therefore, we might see a drop-off in affordable housing if it's easier to navigate that system, because I think you're an expert in doing that.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in navigating it in a negative way, because we work for as many authorities as we do for developers. I think the clarity that the document gives doesn't mean that viability tested route will be easier for developers. It will be challenging for them to deliver whatever affordable housing level they can deliver based on their viability. It is still a very high bar to meet. Particularly for schemes that are referable to the Mayor. So the viability team in the Mayor's office, who you've heard from today, add an extra layer of scrutiny. So you've got the borough scrutinising the viability assessment, and their advisors. You then have the GLA's team adding an extra layer of scrutiny. Although the document gives greater clarity, everybody knows in the industry that it is not an easy route to go down, that every stone will be turned and you will have to justify every single input into your appraisal. And there is still the incentive out there to avoid all of that and do the 35%. Providing developers feel that their scheme can get to that reasonably with growth and cost inflation over the life of the planning consent. I don't think that greater clarity would incentivise anybody to go down the viability tested route. I think they would only go down that route as a last resort. If they can get to 35% reasonably, I think they would choose to do so.
Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. And then finally from me on this, I will start with you, sorry, if that's okay. Build to rent. So we had a bit of a discussion about that in the previous section. It's obviously a relatively new thing, and there's more detail now about build to rent, and I've actually marked pages, build to rent and how to assess different tenures for providing affordable housing within build to rent. Do you think that there's enough in there for build to rent providers to go on, and for councils to do their work of assessing these schemes. And do you, again, we talked earlier about the fact that 35% has just been also applied to build to rent. Is that the right threshold for that type of development, or should it be different than the wider threshold for fast track?
Excuse me. On your second point, I think there's been a conception historically that build to rent is more difficult in terms of viability than build for sale. I think that's now probably the opposite way round, that build to rent is easier to bring forward than build for sale in current market conditions, because you haven't got the uncertainty of having to find 100 individuals to buy your units that you have if you were selling, whereas with build to rent there's significant institutional appetite for investment in build to rent. Getting an investor to invest in a 100-unit build to rent scheme is far easier as a prospect than getting 100 individuals to buy flats from you. So to that degree, the risk profile is probably flipped. So there's lower risk in build to rent than there is in build for sale, and many more developers are looking at build to rent as a way of diversifying the mix of product on their schemes.
So 35% could be higher then?
Conceivably, I think it would need to be explored, but yes, certainly I think that's something that could be looked at. In terms of your first question, and what can the guidance do in terms of guiding on build to rent, I think the difficulty is that build to rent, as you rightly point out, is an emerging product. It's still quite new, although it's now becoming sort of a key feature of the planning system. There are still only a few market operators in this sector, and they are keeping data very close to their chest and not revealing to anybody else, potential market entrants, what their data is on operating costs and how yields work in financing. So in that regard, it's difficult for the guidance to actually be definitive on certain points because of that lack of clarity and lack of data.
Have any build-to-rent developments gone through the viability route? Are they all just making the threshold?
No, there have been some build-to-rent schemes through that route, yeah.
Joshim, have you seen any go through that process yourself? And do you have any comment to add on the build-to-rent question?
No, I think Anthony's right. It's a difficult one because it is a relatively new product and one that we're seeing a lot more regularly. We've tested a few. The difficulty is getting the information out. Where you don't have the information, you don't want to set down guidance around something that you don't know fully aware what you don't fully know of. It could, in fact, be a bit dangerous. So I think leaving it relatively loose at this stage is probably the best thing. But I suspect through consultations there might be some responses from the industry in how that could be shaped. There's a lot of questions around deliverability of build-to-rent schemes, the funding sources, also the management of build-to-rent schemes, and also kind of spinning off from that co-living schemes as well, are kind of coming forward. Again, quite difficult to kind of pin. You kind of see them popping around in different parts of London. I tend to see them in slightly more high-value areas, but again, a very similar kind of beast where it can be a little bit difficult. So it's probably not the best idea to try and throw guidance at it, other than be transparent, bring forward your information the best you can, and that will probably help assessors, the public sector, and as well as the private sector to kind of collaborate, to work together and try and capture as much affordable housing on them as well. But yes, it's a product that is more favourable now, build to rent, easier to get tenants, quicker rather than a sale. Interest rates are all over the place. People are not getting mortgages that they were promised a long time ago. So why not go to build to rent? But then on the flip side, I think the guidance also captures any changes. If an operator decides we're going to flip it to build for sale, I believe that's also captured in the guidance and how to assess that for affordable housing purposes, if it goes through the viability tested route.
Okay, thank you very much. Dinah, would it be possible to ask you about build to rent? I don't know if your panel has looked at this at all, but there's most build to rents that have happened so far provide only intermediate rents, and there is guidance in section 5 of the affordable housing guidance that talks about the 10-year split that is required. Which even within the Affordable Housing at 35% seems only to be 30% of that at London living rents and the rest at some other discount market rent. So I'm again, given what Anthony's been saying, I'm not sure there isn't some ask to be made about creating more guidance around providing potentially social levels of rent. Would you like to comment on that? So I'm just giving you my opinion. That's not quite right.
I mean, I think, from the panel's point of view, ways of delivering more social rent would be welcome, hugely welcome. I think if all that happens with all of these approaches is, and sort of picking up on one of the comments from Anthony, that people will look to deliver those 10 years within the affordable, unaffordable bracket that the terminology that's being used. If that is done such that more social rent is provided on the scheme as a whole, and I'm conscious of that's the argument in terms of increasing the household income threshold up to 67,000. I think that's welcome if that is what happens. And I suppose that's the difficulty. It's actually predicting both the developer market, the route that the developer market follows, as well as how local authorities then negotiate in terms of their own discretionary elements of the targets. I mean, I don't think that there is any. One of the problems that we have is that we don't have evidence of actually what happens. There's all sorts of assumptions, which is why we've ended up with corridors and all the rest. There is all sorts of assumptions in terms of how you developed what I always used to call mixed and balanced communities. But we don't really have any hard and fast evidence in terms of doing that in a successful way, other than perhaps looking at the way in which some existing council blocks are de facto occupied as mixed tenure blocks and seem to work. But again, the research isn't really there to support that. I am interested in your comment that potentially the 35% figure might be higher if the risks are lower to developers bringing forward build to rent. And I'm surprised that there isn't more information on the management and maintenance side of things, because housing associations produce that information into the, well, at least not completely into the public realm, but it is available to the GLA to look at and to local authorities to look at. So I think that's quite an interesting one, although I think, just picking up what was just said, there is, from the guidance point of view, it would make it harder to flip between the different 10-year approaches if a developer decides to flip from a build-to-rent route to a sales route, or vice versa, if you don't have the same number.
Yeah. Okay, that's incredibly useful. Thank you very much. Okay. And Chair, I'm done, but I just wanted to point out that I think. Oh, go on. Yeah, sorry, I was going to ask you because you don't do build to rent.
We do have one build. We have one build to rent scheme at the moment, and it is an area we're looking at doing increasing activity in. So that scheme did actually follow the fast track. It was at over 35% affordable. I would say we are facing at the moment in the current market the same challenges as on discount market sale schemes with the cost inflation. I think a lot of build to rent schemes at the moment based on pretty much a lot of them are high-density tall buildings, are getting hit by the second stair core issue. And I'd say, yes, definitely there's a lot of buoyancy in the build-to-rent market in terms of rental values, but equally at the moment I think with interest rates continuing to rise, the fire issues, kind of caps on rental increases in some instances, it's perhaps not quite as buoyant as perhaps it might have been 6 to 12 months ago. So I think clearly it does need careful testing, and to a degree a bit like the 35% with more traditional market sale products, etc. It needs testing in the market and embedding in the land values, and at the moment I think everyone's pretty much aware of the 35% threshold and land values are continuing on that basis. One thing I'd say in terms of kind of looking at management costs and fees and what we call the operational expenditure of the development, I think we've been doing an enormous amount of work about where we sit in terms of affordability with other products in the market. And it's quite hard to benchmark because you've got such a different offering across build-to-rent providers. So ultimately, where you've got an all-singing, all-dancing facility which is got considerably higher market rents, their operational expenditure is going to be far higher in terms of the management and maintenance of all those additional facilities compared to perhaps more affordable products out there. But I think the other bit that's very challenging at the moment is the guidance, I believe, sets out the threshold that should be LLR, and then the remainder, so of your 35% affordable, the proportion to be LLR, but the remainder is at the discretion of local authorities or with negotiation with local authorities or perhaps a GLA on larger schemes. And we're seeing enormous differences across the board in schemes we're looking at. So ultimately, that is really going to impact the overall level of the 35% or not as well. We're seeing it varying enormously across boroughs.
Okay. That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. Chair, what I was going to say was really directly related to that. The two sections, 5.1.3 and 5.1.4 in the draft guidance that talk about this 10-year split within build to rent are very confusing and quite contradictory, I think. I don't think they're super clear. Your assumption just then was that the 30% London living rent was the lower end and the rest of it was higher. The next paragraph seems to suggest that the rest is more affordable. So I don't think there's clarity there. And there's two phrases, more affordable and genuinely affordable, are not very clearly defined.
And yeah, just say we've had instances where sometimes the rents have been higher than LLR, and in other boroughs the rents are lower than LLR, so it has varied.
Yes, exactly. And without clarity, no wonder you're seeing differences in different boroughs. So I wonder if there's something we can feed back on that, maybe as a committee.
No, that's really helpful, thank you, and I think that's been noted, so I'm sure that will make its way into our response in some form. Dinah.
Thank you very much. I was just picking up on something just then on the build to rent side of things, and just wanted to flag up community-led housing in terms of potentially being able to deliver rented products at lower maintenance costs because of the community-led aspects to the living, even if the quantum of facilities, maybe not swimming pools, but the quantum of shared facilities are much higher than on typical schemes.
Thank you for that. If there's no more follow-ups to Assemblymember Berry, I'll pass over to Assemblymember Boff to ask our final question, and then if there's any follow-ups from that to the committee members, we'll put that to the guests.
Actually, just one question to Mr. Lee is that a while ago you were quoted as saying that the viability tests are a necessary evil. We've discussed why they're evil. Why are they necessary?
That's a good question, and my response to that, and I think the necessary evil is probably quite an apt description. Necessary because what we have in London and elsewhere is a policy regime that seeks to maximise affordable housing on a site-by-site basis. So the 50% target is not achievable in every single case, and the policy recognises that point. So it's not applied as a quota that to secure planning consent you must provide 50%. It's 50% subject to viability. So in order to establish the maximum viable percentage on every single site that comes forward, there is this test to prove if it's not 50%, it's 40, 30, whatever percent it might be able to deliver. So you can have that system, or you can have something that says, okay, we'll have a quota system that you have to provide X% affordable and if you don't, then you don't get planning consent. In order to get that latter policy regime through a local planning examination, you have to prove that almost every single site in your borough or district could provide that percentage, and it would be far lower than 50%, because you've got this range of schemes. If you put them on a graph, you'd get some that can do 0%, some that can do 50%, and everything in between. If you say we're going to scrap viability as a test and apply a quota, you've got to say, well, most of our schemes on that graph can do up to 25% affordable or up to whatever percent. Therefore, we can have our fixed affordable housing level at that point. So if you've got this trade-off between certainty of delivery and a policy that you'll always deliver versus maximising affordable housing across the borough. The policy regime we've got does the latter. It's seeking to deliver the maximum amount from development as a whole by individually testing schemes and maximising delivery up to 50% on every single site. So in essence, it's a tool that helps you to deliver the policy.
You also said some years ago that 20% is something is better than 50% of nothing. Do you think if those numbers were to change, the 35 and 50, if they were to be halved, do you think we'd end up with more homes or less homes?
I think, again, it depends on how you apply policy. If you apply policy as a quota, then you would get probably less homes if you have a high affordable housing target, because you can't get enough sites to work. That would be the trade-off. So what the current system does, it encourages developers to bring land forward because they know that they can tailor the affordable housing within that policy envelope to what that particular scheme and site can afford. Whereas if you say, well, let's scrap what we do at the moment and just have a fixed target, it will be lower. And because it's fixed, you may get fewer sites coming forward, because some would say in their existing use, because they just wouldn't be valuable enough to the landowner for them to bring them forward.
Right. It's more about policy than economics, though, isn't it?
It's where economics meets policy and the two interact. So viability testing is an expression of how one meets that policy, in effect.
And to everyone, this is the famous finisher question, which I'll slightly recast. Is there anything in half an hour's time that you'd wish you'd have said before we close the meeting?
Yes. I think the guidance now starts to refer specifically to certain abnormals being excluded, so rights of light, assumptions, asbestos, and I'm unclear why that's being removed, and especially rights of light, I think, at the moment, which is an enormous risk out there and really challenging on lots of projects. We've got really large insurance policies and taking a lot of risk in respect to that, so I'm not clear why it's being suggested it should be removed from development costs.
Right. Anything else? Mr. Lake?
Yes, I mean, I think I would just conclude by saying that ultimately, within the London Plan policy envelope, schemes will deliver what they can deliver based on their viability, and the way viability is tested is clearer as a result of the guidance. But ultimately, what schemes can deliver will be down to their own economics.
Mr.
I'd also add that viability is obviously a tool, and you try and see what a scheme could viably provide. And I think in the previous session they were talking about deficits and the eradication of deficits where possible. I think the new guidance talks about deliverability quite in some detail, and a developer should come forward to a public authority demonstrating exactly how they're going to develop a site or deliver a site, and if it's so underwater, demonstrate to an authority why and how they're pursuing it. And I think that's very important, because a common question that you kind of see public residents talk about, committee members, is, it's so in the red, why are you doing it? keep the land as it is. And a lot of the time, I've never got a true answer other than, oh well, you've got viability reviews in place, so that'll capture any increase. And I've always found that to be an indication that a developer's looking at growth assumptions over time. So why not look at that today? And I think the guidance captures that better than before. So a positive.
Okay. Ms. Roke, have you got anything you want to say before we go?
Only really that we've not talked very much about the link to the affordable housing programme, current one, and the use of that to actually make up the gap between wherever someone's coming in terms of 35 or 50%, to use the new affordable housing programme to increase the quantity of social rented housing in London, which is so vitally needed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you very much to our guests. That was incredibly informative, and I think for us to go away and cultivate and think about how we integrate that into our response. So we're very grateful for your time. We've now reached the end of this session. I would like to thank again our guests for attending the meeting and for your contributions today. The committee has a few more items of business to quickly deal with, so I'd ask if you'd be all right for just sticking around for a moment. Sometimes it's just quicker and easier rather than having an exit in the middle of it. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion today? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from discussion? Sorry. Just writing something down on my piece of paper so I don't forget. Can I ask committee to note its meeting dates as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 4th of May 2023? The next meeting of the Planning Regeneration Committee will take place on the 4th of July 2023 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber City Hall. I will be gutted to say that Sarah Jane will not be joining us for that because she will be on maternity leave, which is very exciting for herself and her family. But this is the last meeting before we lose you to a far more enjoyable... Not to say that we won't be having that here on the Planning Regeneration Committee, but very, very happy for you. Any other business? I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of the sunshine.
Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.